Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started with this very special evening. We are here tonight with our guest, David Bernstein, who is the author of Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms the Jews. And I just want to say a few words before we start. This is actually our leadoff event to our Stronger Together Fighting to End Jew Hatred Anti-Semitism Education Conference. Our conference will be taking place on September 10th, 2023. That is a Sunday, and we will be operating from 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. The conference includes exciting keynote speakers and a multitude of breakout sessions that are offered from numerous community groups, Jewish community groups in our area. We have sessions that are geared towards students, parents, community members. We have sessions that are geared towards educators and policymakers. So there's something for everyone, and we really hope that we will see you there. You can actually join us by going to strongertogether.co.il, and you will see the website. You will be able to see how to get tickets for the event, where it's happening, and a whole bunch more of other information. So we wanted to make sure that we gave you an idea of what we're all about as we lead up to the conference. And we wanted to broach some very important issues. And one of the important issues, or I shouldn't say one, but a large percentage of what we're talking about entails the content of David Bernstein's book. And I'm going to let him speak about it, but it's very apropos where we're heading into a holiday this week of Passover, where we are celebrating not only celebrating our freedom and our liberation from slavery under the Egyptians, but we also exit into many different situations where we explore who we are as a people, what we believe, how we follow our paths. And this is a lot of what's going on today. Unfortunately, we see a lot of things that are occurring these days that are not favorable for most of the Jewish people. And there are very specific circumstances under which these things occur. And David has done a wonderful job of laying these out in his book. A little bit about David before I turn it over. David's a passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas and Israel. He's also the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. It opposes illiberal ideologies and supports the free expression of ideas in and out of the Jewish community. He's also co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values, a consortium of like-minded organizations supporting liberal principles, and he's the past president and CEO of Jewish Council for Public Affairs and the former executive director of the David Project. He spent 13 years at the American Jewish Committee in senior roles, and he's a prolific speaker, podcaster, and writer, having written hundreds of opinion pieces in the Jewish and general press. David, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I know there were some complications with flights and weather, and that was beyond our control, but we're very glad that you're here with us over Zoom.
It's great to be with you. I really wish I could have been there in person, and I hope to take a rain check. Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thanks to the committee that put this event on. I want to start with two really short stories. One happened in May 2020. It involved a Jewish demographer named Ira Sheskin and his partner, Arnold Deshevsky. These are the guys that come into a local Jewish community. I bet you have them in Canada as well. Perhaps they've done a communal study where they survey the community and they find out how many Jews live there and where they live and what the general attitudes are, so that the Jewish community can do strategic planning, decide where to locate its buildings and the like. So that's what they've been doing for many years. And in May 2020, they had the misfortune of writing an article in a publication called E-Jewish Philanthropy, which argued that there were fewer Jews of color than a recently released survey by something called the Jews of Color Project had indicated. In that survey, they said there were 12 to 15% Jews of color, but Ira and Arnold knew from the more recent Pew survey that it couldn't be much over 8%. And when they wrote that article, they faced an immediate firestorm in the Jewish community. There was a petition drive that was held that garnered 2,500 signatures of some very prominent Jews who condemned the two for racism. And the head of the Reform movement, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, somebody who I've always respected, accused the two of white intellectualism, which I had never heard before. I'd never heard the term intellectualism used as a pejorative. So that's story number one, Exhibit A. So Exhibit B is Dr. Ron Albucher. Dr. Albucher is a psychiatrist who was the former head of a psychiatric clinic at Stanford University and still continued to work there up until recently. In July 2020, there was a town hall event in Stanford, a Zoom town hall event. This was in the middle of the pandemic. And that was Zoom bombed. I don't know if you remember that term, where people interrupted it in the middle and started putting all kinds of online graffiti that included the use of the N-word, included swastikas as well. During that time, it was right in the great racial reckoning in the wake of George Floyd's killing. There was a diversity, equity, and inclusion process going on in Ron's clinic. And they were discussing the town hall event that was Zoom bombed. And they were talking about the racism that was obvious in that. But Ron thought, well, listen, swastikas are anti-Semitic. There was anti-Semitic graffiti as well. And he raised that idea and immediately got shouted down by everybody for taking the spotlight off of anti-Blackness, off of anti-Black racism. Ron was also asked to participate in affinity groups that were there, racial affinity groups. So there was a white affinity group, there was a Latino affinity group, there was an Asian affinity group. But Ron and another Jewish employee of the clinic did not feel comfortable in any of those, and they requested a Jewish affinity group, and they were denied. Now, these are two very different incidents. What do they have to do with each other? One is sort of an intra-Jewish conflict between, different forces and different ideas. That's the one that took place with Ira Sheskin, the demographer. And the other is probably a much more explicit anti-Semitic event where Jews were not even allowed to talk about anti-Semitism that occurred in their own ranks. But I will argue actually that the two incidents both emerge out of a specific ideology. We could call it woke ideology. You could call it radical social justice ideology. The word woke has kind of come under a great deal of scrutiny these days. So, if you don't like it, we could come up with something else. But in any event, that ideology holds that there are oppressed and oppressors in the world. It's a very binary ideology. It's a binary worldview. Let me just define it for you with a little bit more detail. Wokeism holds two basic tenets. The first is that bias and oppression are not just a matter of one's personal attitudes. They're also embedded and ingrained in the very structures and systems of society. They're in the air that we breathe. So racism is not just prejudice that you have at a personal level, but it is part and parcel of society. That's number one. The second tenet is that only the people who have experienced that oppression are qualified to define it for the rest of society. They've experienced it, they've seen it, they have the lived experience to define it for the rest of society. I see somebody saying that it's like postmodernism and critical race theory. Yes, I mean, those are all under the general ideological umbrella of wokeism. Right. But in fact, in some ways, wokeism, you could argue, emerged directly out of postmodern thought. So we won't get too detailed there, but I'm going to argue that both of those incidents are related. And it's actually quite easy for the Jewish community to end up engaging in its own form of this that unknowingly actually foments anti-Semitism. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about. The second thing I'm going to argue is that it's not enough just to oppose anti-Semitism as it manifests itself. Today's anti-Semitism, and I would argue it's always been the case, emerges directly out of ideologies. So you have ideologies on the right, like the Great Replacement theory, the idea that immigrants are coming into the United States, presumably Canada as well, and they're taking the jobs of ordinary Americans, and the Jews are doing the replacing. That's an ideology that's enjoys increasing popularity on the right. But I would argue that wokeism is an ideology that in its embrace of the oppressed oppressor binary that also inherently foments anti-Semitism. And if you're going to fight anti-Semitism, it means you have to fight the underlying ideologies that animate it. So I'm going to share with you a few pictures just to illustrate some of the trends that we're talking about here. Just 1 second. I'm going to start the slideshow. All right. So when I say anti-Semitism on the left, I imagine you picture something like this. Now, I don't know if I look at it closely, I may be able to get an idea of what year that was in, but suffice it to say, it could have happened anytime in the last 15 years, right? Where you saw sort of the boycott Israel, the BDS movement emerge. But what we're seeing today is much, much more of this than we did 15 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. I recently had this conversation with Ken Marcus. I don't know if you know Ken. Ken is the founder and CEO of a group called the Brandeis Institute for Human Rights. And Ken is involved in taking legal action on behalf of Jewish students and faculty who face discrimination on U.S. college campuses. In fact, his organization, the Brandeis Center, is representing Dr. Ron Albacher at Stanford University, among other clients. Ken told me just the other day when we were having lunch that in the early days of his institute, the Brandeis Institute, he was just him and an assistant. And today he has a much larger team, and they are dealing with much higher volume, and they're busier now with a much bigger team than they were 10, 15 years ago when the Institute got started. In other words, the volume of these incidents on campus and off campus is much greater than it was before. And the question is why? Why are we seeing this happen more now than we did before? There's also data that would support this as well. This is from a poll that my organization took, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, in August of 2022, so just a few months ago. And we asked the question, do you view Israel as a sovereign nation which has the right and obligation to defend itself? Or do you view Israel as an occupier and a colonizer using the modern military to attack defensive Palestinians? Now, in the US, you still see that Israel enjoys an advantage collectively. But if you look on the left side of here, and the orange represents the occupier colonizer narrative, you can see that on the progressive left that Israel's really lost a lot of ground, and that this most radical narrative is gaining ground. And it also is of a piece with the recent Gallup poll data, which shows that Israel's losing ground. And so this ideology that we're seeing that is caught on in American society is having direct effect on the way large swaths of Americans see Israel. If there was ever a time when this should have been plain to us that we're facing a problem, it was really in May 2021, in that last round of hostilities between Israel and Hamas. This is a piece by Batya Ungar-Sargon, who used to be opinion editor of The Forward, and now she's the deputy opinion editor of Newsweek. And I want to read it to you. When it comes to Israel, the American far left has long been woke. But what's new is the ubiquity of such discourse in mainstream American media. In the past, we didn't see Israel's colonialist project in the Washington Post headlines, or MSNBC headlines insisting that the latest Israel-Palestinian crisis isn't a quote-unquote real estate dispute. It's ethnic cleansing. In other words, the radical narrative is starting to gain ground in the mainstream left in American society. And that, in my judgment, is a direct result of the spread of this woke ideology throughout American society, and particularly in institutions. Now, here's the issue. A lot of what we see under the rubric of woke ideology doesn't appear to be directly anti-Semitic. This is what's called the wheel of power and privilege. I would imagine that most high school students in the US have seen this at some point. almost every college student I'm sure has. It's in corporate diversity trainings and the like. And what it does is it really shows you how much power or privilege you have by virtue of your identity. So if you're white, you're privileged. If you're black, you're oppressed. If you're a woman, you're oppressed. If you're a male, you're privileged, and so on and so forth. And it's very, very rigid, as this wheel of power and privilege would tell you, right? But nowhere on there are Jews explicitly named. But the problem is when you directly link privilege, the idea of privilege and identity, you end up inexorably with the idea of Jewish privilege, right? It's not that hard because Jews are viewed as being at the very upper echelon of society. So so there are some Jews who say in the face of this, well, let's let them understand that Jews really are not oppressed, that Jews are really oppressed, that we experienced the Holocaust, that we've experienced discrimination, both in the United States and Canada and in other Western countries. Of course, we should be considered part of the oppressed. But the problem is that in this ideology, success, economic success, is conflated with being an oppressor. So if you are above the mean in economics, you are going to be viewed as the oppressor. And we can't get out of that bind. That is the problem we're facing. Now, again, it doesn't always explicitly name Jews. This is something from Tima Okun's white supremacy culture. Okay? White supremacy culture is a framework that is making its way in the pedagogies of teachers and diversity trainers around the United States, and I promise you in Canada as well. This is in my kids' school district in Montgomery County, Maryland, where there's about 100,000 Jews. Now, again, you will not find Jews on here. Let me interpret this for you. It is all of these ideas here are considered expressions of white supremacy culture. Now, what is white supremacy culture? It's a culture, it's the idea that American culture, by its very nature, favors white values, white norms, and by its very nature discriminates against those people of color. So, for example, the idea of being prompt and on time at work is considered a white supremacy value. If you look on the left side, so where it says denial of white privilege, if you deny the idea of white privilege, that means that you are engaging in white supremacy culture. If you look in the blue toward the bottom, color blindness, if you argue that for the ideal of color blindness, you are engaging in white supremacy culture. Again, imagine that if somebody believes that they should, a young person, a high school student thinks that we should live in a colorblind society, and they're told that they're on the pyramid of white supremacy. So, but what does this have to do with the Jews? This next slide comes really out of the same presentation that teachers are being trained in around the United States, that is endorsed specifically by the National Education Association, which is America's largest teachers union. And by the way, if it's in the US, it's even more so in Canada. You can bet on that. Okay, so what does this say? It says being honest with ourselves. And let's look at the picture. The picture is of these are neo-Nazis who, with tiki torches in Charlottesville, 2019, who were marching around a synagogue. Do we look at this image and think that's not me, or I am not that kind of white person, or not all white people are like those white people? Do we want to view ourselves as good white people and distance ourselves from bad white people? How does this good-bad binary get in the way of accepting that we are participants and reinforcers of a system of white supremacy? In other words, we're all complicit in white supremacy. We are all like the marchers around Charlottesville. But just think about who the marchers were protesting. They were all around a synagogue. So in a way, and I'm sure they didn't even think this through, that they're equating the white, quote unquote, white Jews inside that synagogue with the neo-Nazis marching outside of it. That's how this ideology leads to a kind of anti-Semitism. Now, this is a slide that is being taught in many school systems around the United States under the rubric of ethnic studies. You might have heard of ethnic studies. If not, it's coming to a city near you in Canada. I'm sure it's already in places in Vancouver and Toronto, and Montreal, and the like. It started in California in 2020. Well, it's really started decades ago in the university system in California. And it teaches the oppressive narrative. Now, some versions of this teach about the oppressor narrative, but they don't explicitly name Jews in Israel. But some versions of this, specifically those done by what are called the Liberated Ethnic Studies group, these are people who are pushing the most radical forms of this ethnic studies around the United States, are pushing this narrative. Now, if you look at these maps of Palestine and Israel in 1946, it shows the entire country as being all green, that is Palestinian land. In 1947, it was partitioned, and you see most of it now is Jewish land. And in 1949 through 1967, you see it further change. And now today, in 2011, you see the Palestinians have been systematically depopulated. That is the settler colonialist narrative that is in ethnic studies. You can look, by the way, at the United States and how it portrays the United States as well. This is in major school systems already. This is not something that I made up. This is actually curricular material being taught in schools in the United States right now. And so you could look at this and say, yes, I recognize the anti-Semitism of it. But if you don't understand the anti-Semitism in this, or the potential of anti-Semitism in this, then we really don't understand what we have to fight, because these lead to that. And I think we have to really ask ourselves, what does it mean to fight anti-Semitism today? It's not just fighting the obvious manifestations. It's not just fighting the anti-Zionism in your schools or the BDS campaign. It is finding the underlying ideology that will automatically give rise to that. I just want to share, I'm almost done here, and we're going to do some questions with Rabbi Margulies, but I want to show you another way this manifests itself. At the bottom here is a woman who writes to, the woman called The New Normal, Natalie Hopkinson, is a professor who wrote an article in the New York Times about the women of the Louis Farrakhan's Million Man March. All right, and it was a glowing portrayal of how women helped build the Million Man March. Now, Natalie, this woman below, her name is Jewess T, or Shara, writes, Natalie Hopkinson, your piece in the New York Times makes me sad. I wish your glowing article about Farrakhan was the whole truth. The reality is, whether you like it or not, vile, unrepentant, and relentless anti-Semitism is part of your legacy as well. And this is how Professor Hopkinson responds. You know what makes me sad? Literally millions of people involved in this essay. You don't center the marchers. You don't center the Black women who are named and linked. You don't even center Farrakhan. You center yourselves and your feelings. Now, so she's reducing her concerns about anti-Semitism to a whine. And this is what you're seeing more in this discourse, is that not only can the discourse be anti-Semitic, but it actually calls us on the carpet, as it did with the Stanford psychiatrist Ron Albacher, for even mentioning anti-Semitism, for even trying to bring it into the diversity conversation. And that is a huge problem. It really, if we take it seriously, can really make it impossible to combat anti-Semitism effectively. One last slide, and we'll do a Q&A. This is right out of last week. A mainstream Jewish organization, I'm not going to name, out in the San Francisco Bay Area, wrote a letter to its constituents because there were problems about the way ethnic studies was being taught in a school district in California, and there were a lot of people in the Jewish community who were pushing back. And this is a defense of what's going on in the school district, okay? Quote, objections to the California school district's curriculum appear to be ideologically based, with some questioning the inclusion of concepts such as systems of power and oppression, concepts that are included in the California Ethnic Studies model curriculum. While segments of our community may object to teaching these concepts, these concerns are not related to Jewish identity, anti-Semitism, or Israel, and should not be conflated with anti-Israel bias. I could not disagree more. And I think that is our problem. Rabbi, let's maybe do some questions.
Absolutely. First of all, let me say that I can't find anything to disagree with what you're saying. From a Canadian perspective, we've experienced a lot of the issues that you mentioned. We're seeing such a push for the far left way of thinking that it ignores other people's views. We see this heads or tails, or oppressed or oppressor type of mentality. And some of the examples, like your pyramid of racism or white supremacy, where we see at the top that the swastika is a symbol of white supremacy, where people tend to ignore the fact that all of those white supremacist organizations view the Jews as non-white, as a target, as an object of hate. They follow the teachings and the precepts of Hitler. They follow those precepts of being part of the ideal race, or attempting to be that ideal race, and we're victims of it. So I definitely appreciate where you're coming from and what you're saying. I think that it's important because a lot of people look at the title of the book and they know that you're one of the founders of the Jewish Institute of Liberal Values. That maybe perhaps you could explain how your ideas and your ideas of illiberalism don't conflict with your own values. Would you mind
Sure.
explaining that a bit?
Sure. I just want to comment on one thing you said. I think that's really important about Jews being viewed as part of the white supremacist dominant class. A colleague of mine, Pamela Peresky, wrote that when whiteness was considered a moral good, Jews were viewed as white. When whiteness is considered an unmitigated, Jews were not white. When whiteness is considered an unmitigated evil, Jews are considered white. And so we're facing pressures from both sides of this ideological spectrum, that and simultaneously, and in some ways they start to converge like a horseshoe at some point as well, which we can talk about. So my organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, was formed almost 2 years ago. I have been a long time Jewish advocate for center-left organization called the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. I've been in the business of building bridges to other ethnic and religious communities, part of the larger civil rights coalition in the United States, most of my career. Obviously also a staunch pro-Israel advocate and a fighter of anti-Semitism. But in my view, for most of my career, those two things were not in conflict. They might have been in tension sometimes, but not in conflict. And in some ways, I felt that the one way I could fight anti-Semitism on the left was by engaging the left in conversation and trying to peel away some of the more moderates in the left from the more radical voices. That's the model that we did for many years. And we thought it didn't always work, but it sometimes worked. And it was a strategy that kept BDS on the sidelines, more or less. But what I started to see around 2016 was sort of the onset of intersectional ideology, with the onset of this broader woke ideologies, that stopped working very well, and it became harder and harder to do that work. And I also felt that the segments of the Jewish community themselves were sort of now captured by these ideological trends, and that they were short-circuiting the normal deliberative process around issues of race and racism and so forth. Everybody was sort of forced to toe the party line. So I left that job just over 2 years ago to start this new organization that was launched by some very prominent voices like New York Times columnist Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss and Rabbi David Wolpe and others who signed the original letter that ended up leading to the establishment of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. So that's what we do. Well, by liberal, we do not mean progressive left. We mean liberal as in politically open to alternative ideas. A Jewish term that we often use that I think captures the same sentiment is machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven, which are really deeply embedded in the Jewish tradition and the Talmudic tradition and the like. So that's what the sentiment we're trying to capture. We believe that machloket l'shem shamayim has been often eclipsed by this ideology on the left, and too many Jewish organizations have sort of forgot their core commitment to liberal values.
Thank you. So when you, in your book, you actually talk about the etymology of the woke ideology, or the term woke, and then you talk about the divergence from the original intent and how it's taken on a life of its own to be something that most of us will view as negative because of the way that it's been handled, much like a lot of social justice issues or organizations. Certain people have run away with it and perverted the original intent, making it something that's unpalatable, well, at least for the Jewish community, or for those of us in the mainstream Jewish community, not for certain people, but that's what we need to be careful of. Can you perhaps just talk about the origin of that term?
Yeah, so woke is a term that came out of the Black community. There's songs about it going way back into the 1930s. So it's been around, and the idea was to be aware of systems of racism around us. Obviously, in the 1960s in America, Jim Crow laws and the like made America quite oppressive toward Black people. And I think it would have been correct to describe America in those days as a pervasively racist country. So that's the original use of the term woke. But over time it became used to say, I can see systems of racism, and because I'm oppressed myself, you can't. So for you, these are invisible, but for me, they're visible. And as a result, I get to define the world for you. That's sometimes referred to as something called standpoint epistemology. It's a very technical term, but that idea that only people with lived experience get to define reality for the rest of us is a very deeply illiberal idea. It's saying that the conversation is closed, and if you have a different opinion about what constitutes racism or what constitutes Islamophobia or homophobia, if you have a different opinion than that, you're engaging in a kind of privilege or even racism by just questioning the doctrine, because you don't have the lived experience that qualifies you to have an opinion. So that becomes then the root cause of cancel culture. It's used to shut down debate and discussion on issues that they considered settled because people with lived experience have defined them that way. And I think it's an extremely illiberal idea, and I think it's also obviously gives rise to its own form of prejudice, which we're seeing in the Jewish community. And by the way, Chinese Americans and Chinese Canadians, I imagine, and Indian Americans and Indian Canadians, I imagine, are feeling some of the same effects. Just a little story to give you a sense of this, because both of those communities are on average doing better than the mean. By the way, so are Nigerian Americans, and some other people from other African countries are doing better than white Americans on average. So little story, a few months ago, I spoke at a Chinese American conference, about 600 people. I was on a panel. And the CEO, somebody I've known a long time, said to me, please don't go into all that anti-woke stuff. You know, I agree with you, but you're going to alienate my people if you do that. I said, sure, no worries, I won't. Well, it got to the very end of the panel, and somebody asked a pointed question, and I sort of lost myself in the moment. And I said, well, I don't think that narrative of America as a pervasively oppressive country is one that either of our communities should buy into. That's not who we are. Sure, America or Canada, let's say, are imperfect countries trying to live up to their own high ideals, but they're not pervasively racist. They're not white supremacist countries. And I don't think that's the right narrative for either of our communities. I got a standing ovation. I couldn't leave the hall afterwards. And I saw my friend, and he came up to me and he said, thank you for doing that, because I didn't even know my own people. And so we happen to, I'm going to argue also that there are potential allies that most in the Jewish community haven't even built, because we're so wed to the progressive allies that we've been working with in the past several decades.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. We see it here as well. I mean, maybe we didn't see it technically by the term cancel culture in Canada, although it was occurring. We've seen those who don't toe the party line, so to speak, in education, in corporate business, in government, were shunned, were ostracized because they are not willing to stand up. I mean, we've had discussions of people who work in education who were told by supposed anti-racist experts that the first step is to admit that I'm an oppressor, I am a racist, regardless of where you came from, what your background was, who you are. If you didn't fit the narrative of what they constructed as a racist or as an oppressed person, then, like you say, you were automatically an oppressor. And it's such a dangerous thing for us to buy into. Um, I mean, speaking of buying into things, I mean, we have these groups who will say, I'm part of this group, I'm oppressed, I'm the only one who can define it, I'm the only one who can talk about it. But then we have other groups who completely buy into the ideology. So how do you think that actually spreads to other people? How do they buy in if they're not actually part of that group of people?
Yeah, well, it's very hard. Institutions in many ways have been completely captured, and I hate saying that. It sounds so conspiratorial, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist type at all. I'm generally very resistant to conspiracy theories, but institutions, including many Jewish institutions, have sort of bought all of this hook, line, and sinker. There's a phenomenon that's sometimes called identitarian deference, and it really grows out of that idea that only people who have lived experience get to define things for the rest of us. So an institution will say, I'm not really qualified to talk about systemic racism, so I'm going to bring in a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert into our ranks, and that person then will get to tell us what to think about race and racism for the rest of the institution. Now, when that happens, it's sort of signing on the dotted line in a way. You're giving up almost your entire intellectual independence, your moral independence as an actor now, and you're being told precisely what you must think, and you've given into that idea. It's very hard to recapture your independence after you've so explicitly given it up. So I think that's one of the phenomena we're seeing here in institutions. And not all Jewish institutions in the US, and I'm sure in Canada, have fully bought into it. By the way, I would argue that the Jewish community in Canada is less on average woke than the American Jewish community, but that Canada is potentially more woke than the United States, because there's no opposing political force to speak of in Canada that's preventing this from spreading like wildfire. And I think I really feel for the Canadian Jewish community. I think you have to be extremely assertive in demanding your rights and pushing back against any of the anti-Semitic manifestations, because I really believe it's going to gain more ground in Canada potentially than it ever will in the United States. But these institutions now are very hard to push back at, but not all of them. And one of the things that we try to do is I ask the question, to what degree has an institution really given into what you call identitarian deference? To what degree have they signed on the dotted line? Because many of them have sort of, in the moment of the racial reckoning, sort of made some commitments, but they didn't go all the way to sort of renounce their own intellectual independence. And so sometimes they have core liberal values that are still there and deep into the ether of the organization, deep into the culture of the organization, but they've been eclipsed, at least temporarily, by this sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion craze. And I think our job in those situations is to accentuate the tension between those two conflicting value systems and get people to understand you cannot be an organization that champions viewpoint diversity if you're telling everybody what they must think about all these other issues. I know I might have gone a little bit beyond the scope of your question. If I didn't answer it, try it again.
No, that's okay. It's all good information. We've seen a lot of situations where organizations, corporate organizations, secondary, post-secondary schools, and even the government has hired consultants or supposed anti-racist experts. And when Jewish community groups brought up the fact that these particular experts have been very open about their anti-Semitic, anti-Zionistic viewpoint, it seems that doesn't count.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that one instance of a of a high-level DEI person that was being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by the Canadian government. I know my friend Jonathan Kay, who's a Toronto Jew and a writer, was one of the people who exposed it for the rest of society. So I think that's that you're seeing these. Another element of this beyond identitarian deference is DEI bureaucracies that take on a life of their own. And I'm sure you watched what happened in Stanford recently at Stanford Law School when a DEI bureaucrat just simply stifled the free speech of a guest speaker, and
Right.
how damaging these DEI consultancies and bureaucracies can be. Again, they're not all equally bad. There are versions of DEI that I think most of us can live with. Some of them might even be good in some rare cases. But I do think that we're facing writ large a DEI juggernaut that is taking over many institutions, and it's something we have to push back against hard if we're not going to see this continue to catch on and grow.
Agreed 100%. And I know that there's a lot of people that are actually listening right now, attendees, who agree as well, wholeheartedly. So, and one of the things that we keep hearing from some people is that, and I want to ask your opinion on this, is where they state that, well, we need to use their language. The DEI experts come in and we need to use their language or we won't be heard. I have my own opinions on that, but I'm very interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I might have at one point, maybe a couple of years ago, agreed with that look, we're not going to be able to defeat them, so we might as well try to influence their thinking from within. But and it may be some instances where the DEI is not extreme in nature. I think trying to influence their thinking about Jews and the like is a worthy undertaking. But in a lot of cases, they're so ideological that I think the more the Jewish community tries to insinuate itself into that narrative, the more we just simply reinforce the terms of it. And you really see that in California, where I talked about the spread of radical ethnic studies. So in the early days of ethnic studies in California, when it was a bill before the California legislature, the ethnic studies model curriculum was anti-Semitic beyond belief. I mean, anybody would have considered it just beyond the pale. So the Jewish community pushed back against that and got rid of some of the most extreme versions of it. But in doing that, it had to pay the price of admission. It had to accept the overall framework of oppressed versus oppressor, of indoctrinating kids in this oppressed versus oppressor narrative. And I'm arguing that that's no longer a good deal. That because all that does is it sets up a long game of whack-a-mole. Because once you initialize and support that curricular framework, school districts around the state, and in California, there's something like 1,500 school districts in California alone. So imagine how much whack-a-mole you're playing. Many of them are signing contracts with these radical actors like the liberated ethnic studies people. And you're seeing that in cities around the country. It's spreading faster than we can possibly stop. So there's the Jewish dilemma in all that is, do we try to reform DEI from within by being part of the conversation, but in so doing, supporting the fundamental terms of the discussion? And I think the old me would have said, yes, we have to engage. The new me says, we can't engage. This is just too radical, and it's giving rise to anti-Semitism. And I'd rather the most anti-Semitic elements be plain for the public to see, and then go after that than us be in a constant state of accommodation with these actors, because I think that's what it's doing to us in large sectors of the Jewish community.
Agreed. We see all kinds of different organizations that have gone so far to the left that they've become part of the issue, part of the groups, part of the people who are excluding Jews from the conversations when it comes to. I mean, DEI as a term is not a bad thing, looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, but we really have to live by those values in order for it to mean anything. And as long as they're saying, and I apologize for mentioning a different book, but as long as we're saying Jews don't count, really, how are we going to make sure that that's something that's truly encompassing? And having said that, we have large segments of the Jewish community that actually have bought into this wokeism attitude of drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak. So, what do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, I think have been large swaths who have, and by the way, I've even seen training of rabbis and cantors in the liberal denominations, um, teaching the rabbis and cantors to take responsibility for their complicity in whiteness and to engage in the daily acts of disruption of whiteness. That's actually word for word in trainings that rabbis and cantors are being trained in by their denomination. So I think that's extremely dangerous, and I don't think it's something that we should do at all. I think, in fact, if there's anything that I'm trying to do, it's to get the Jewish community, a critical mass in the Jewish community, to realize that we're playing with fire here. That yes, of course, there are people who want us to be in line with the ideological trends of the time, but these ideological trends are dangerous for us. They're not they're not where this is not civil rights 1.0. It's not civil rights 2.0. And it's not even really civil rights. And so we should be very wary of that. Also, yes, I agree with you that DEI inherently doesn't have to be bad, but some of these words in DEI have now become problematic, like the term equity, right? The term equity was brought into popularity by Ibram X. Kendi, who is an academic in Boston, who wrote a best-selling book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And according to Kendi, the only reason why one group can be less successful on average than another group is because of discrimination. So if you think about that for a second, what does that mean for groups like Jews and Asians? If the only reason why somebody can be less successful on average, a group, is because of discrimination, it means that the groups who are doing better than average are complicit in that discrimination. It means that we are complicit in the white supremacy that's holding others down. And so while I agree that there's a definition of equity that I'm sure we could all, that sounds more like equality, that we could all support, the way that equity is often being used, not always, but often being used, is in the exact way that Ibram X. Kendi is arguing. And it argues for a kind of artificial parity that I think is bad for both the people that are traditionally disadvantaged and for the people who are doing better on average. So for the people who are traditionally disadvantaged, okay, so let's say there are 13% African Americans in the United States, and you say there have to be 13% African American scientists in the here and now. That's practically impossible, by the way, because there's something that probably like 3% of scientists are currently African American. So you're now going to try to artificially inflate those numbers of scientists to get to the 13% parity. But what you don't do is you don't invest in young Black scientists. You don't invest in young Black kids in a way that will help them gain the science that they need to be successful scientists in 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. So that's how I think it gets us off track in terms of actually doing what it says it's trying to do. But for the advantage groups, we almost get immediately displaced. There was a powerful article in Tablet Magazine called "The Vanishing of the American Jew" recently. I think it was by Jacob Savage, and it was talking about how American Jews are disappearing, and I suppose the same is happening to Canadian Jews, are disappearing from many institutions and are becoming less and less prominent in many institutions because of this concept of equity. So I think we have a lot at stake here. One time a third of the student body at Yale was Jewish. That's far less now. And imagine if equity continues on the current trajectory, I think a lot of American Jews are going to be displaced from all kinds of institutions in American life.
So do you feel, I mean, I get, you can speak more from the American perspective, obviously, but is today's left going against the values of your ideology, those liberal values? Are we seeing such a shift that's enabling the effect on the institutions, the workplaces, that shift is actually what is actually occurring in the States?
Yeah, so the liberalism that I grew up with believed that there were have and have-nots, and that it was the responsibility of the haves to help the have-nots to do what we could. But it wasn't a theory. The current ideology says that there are have and have-nots, and the haves are causing the deprivations of the have-nots. So it's an ideological statement. It's not a statement of what we owe to society in order to try to bring about some equality, but rather why the situation is the way it is today. So I think that's a huge departure from traditional North American style liberalism. And I think it's become much more ideological. You heard this more in Europe going back a few decades ago in sort of the post-colonial ferment of Europe than you would in the United States. But now we're hearing it more in the United States than we are literally anywhere in Europe, because we've sort of accepted the yoke of anti-racism and wokeism and the like. So I do think that that's one way that the left has changed. Now, is the Democratic Party in the United States on the verge of becoming like the Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party? I would argue not right now. That Democratic voters in the United States are generally speaking more moderate. So what happens is you have a few radicals like AOC, and I'm sure you're familiar with these people on the squad and the like, who do get elected, and there are more of them than there used to be, but there's still a relatively small percentage of the Democratic Party, and Democratic voters, generally speaking, do not like to vote people like that in. That could change over time. I mean, as this ideology continues to make its way through institutions and remake the culture and the like, it could be you wake up one morning when that's no longer the case, where Democratic moderate voters are going to vote down, radicals in their district. And I do think that there's plenty of signs that even among the moderate Democrats in, let's say, Congress and the Senate, they're constantly looking over their left shoulder. And I know people who have been very enmeshed in the pro-Israel community in the United States for a very long time, and they will tell you, if off the record at least, that that while yes, it's true that most Democrats are not like these radicals, they are increasingly worried about their left flank, and they're kowtowing to it more than they used to.
Which is a very scary thing. We know that a lot of the world follows what the U.S. does, and when these people who are in positions of, well, I hate to say it this way, in positions of power, government representatives, elected representatives, have a vocal, if not a majority component or contingency of their constituents who are saying, we want you to think a certain way, we want you to vote a certain way, they tend to go that way. And we see that here in Canada as well. We see people using confirmation bias with Jewish organizations that are anti-Zionist, that are not supporters of the mainstream Jewish society, but they're the ones who are called upon to voice the opinion of the Jewish community, which is very frightening that it's not recognized as such. So I'm going to turn it over in a minute to Anita so that we can get to some audience questions. But before we do, what do you feel we can do to push back against all this? I mean, all this is a really big package to look at, but where do we need to start?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say let's start with ourselves. I think that the American and Canadian Jewish communities should try to model machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven. At my Shabbat dinner table every Friday night, I always raise a question for debate. And no matter what issue, no matter where my kids are, I take the opposite. I play devil's advocate, because I want them to be strong, critical thinkers. I don't want to just tell them what to think. I want to teach them how to think. And so and I think that's central to who we are as Jews. I think that's how a lot of us were raised. Maybe not as explicitly as I did with my own kids, but I think many of us grew up in very argumentative households, charmingly argumentative households. And I think we've got to restore that into our own Jewish culture and to elevate it as a central value of who we are. And that way, I think Jews have a unique role to play. It's sort of as a light unto the nations, we can be a light at a time when there's just so many centrifugal forces that are pulling our society apart. That doesn't mean that we all agree. It just means that we learn to disagree agreeably, and we show why that's so valuable in the spirit of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. The second thing I think we can do is help people find their courage. I can tell you that there are a lot of people who agree with us in government and institutions and the arts and so forth, but they've been sort of bullied into silence. And, I try to remind people, that the consequences may not be as severe as they think. Sometimes they may, but a lot of times they aren't. They've sort of conjured up something that's more serious than what would actually happen if they chose to speak out. And number two, that I remind them that there are brave people in the world who have done important and great things. Like, and Natan Sharansky, through his living example, being in the gulag for 9 years, tells us that we're not going to be disappeared in the United States or Canada for speaking out. So just think, like, compared to what he had to go through, or compared to what the Iranian soccer players at the World Cup who refused to mouth the words of the national anthem, or Iranian schoolgirls who shouted down a party official at their school. I mean, compared to that, this is nothing we're being asked to do. And so I think we have to get people to find their courage. And third, I think we can start to redefine a political center in our societies that both condemns extremism on the right and extremism on the left, and there are new immigrant groups. I mean, I mentioned the Chinese American community. What I've seen there are Indian groups as well. There are Black Americans and Black Canadians who do not want their kids to be taught that the system is rigged against them. I know in Canada you have a strong Indigenous population. I can promise you, if you look hard enough, you'll find voices and leaders who do not want their kids to be told the system is rigged against them, even if the system is rigged against them, because they know that that's downwardly mobile. So I think we have allies in the making. We're working on that now. We've just established a new multi-ethnic coalition that is fighting against the spread of radical ethnic studies, and it includes many of the ethnic communities that I've just talked about. And it's going to be, I think, it's going to be a very important development in the years to come. And I think the mainstream American and Canadian Jewish community should take the lead in that effort.
Thank you.
So those are three things.
I just want to say before I pass it over to Anita, I really love that idea of debating, at the Shabbat table. I mean, I myself, I know many people who will often, when sitting together, at a Shabbat or Yom Tov table, bring up questions or bring up, small little bar Torahs or what have you. But we are actually entering this week into a time where it is perfect to bring up debate, ask questions, get people's opinions, and get conversation going. I mean, I think most people, whether they're, on the observant end of the spectrum or the more egalitarian end or non-observant end, shall we say, will probably be involved in some form of a Passover dinner. So I think that that's the perfect time to start asking some of these questions and have some of these conversations. I'm going to pass you over to Anita, and I will see you at the other end.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you. Well, we have a very engaged audience with a lot of questions, and let's see how much time you have for us. I'm going to say that there are three sort of areas. First is around a bit about the definition. Second is around the challenges and how to meet them, and I know you touched on that. And the third one is some of its ramifications. Specifically, there's a lot of concern being expressed about how it impacts on our love for Israel and the lies that are coming up. I know we said we're not going to get too much into the political realm here. We would be here until tomorrow, which I don't think people will stay on. But those are the sort of the three big areas that I'm going to start with. So number one, the question early on was, can you spend a little time around the very definition? How do we recognize what is wokeism? Is there any parts of it that are good when you're addressing that question of definition? And how does it relate to things that we've heard? We hear terms CRT. Specifically, my question would be, what's the definition under wokeism of racism? Are there some implications of how we're defining racism these days that we should be aware of? So, and I'll let you sort of hit that as you will around the definition.
So in 1999, I was a young Jewish professional, head of the American Jewish Committee in Washington, and I was taking part in a multicultural day. And it was the first time I had ever heard a person use the definition of racism that was completely different than my understanding. The facilitator of that day said, racism equals prejudice plus power. I thought, wait a second. Prejudice plus power. I always thought that racism was just bigotry against another racial group. But what it hit me almost immediately as I was processing this was that if that means that groups that are perceived as powerful can't be victims, and groups that are perceived as powerless can't be victimizers. And that would be extremely bad for the Jewish community because of how we'd be positioned in that equation. I wrote my first article warning about that in 2003, 20 years ago. And it's an article that I could have written today, saying that if that definition catches on and becomes the dominant theme within progressive politics, the Jewish community is going to be in trouble. And I think that's exactly where we are today. That's exactly the definition that has caught on in progressive circles. So I defined wokeism in the beginning, two tenets. Okay, one was that that racism and bias are embedded in the very fabric of society. They're not just attitudes of individuals, right? That can be true, as I said before. Like in Jim Crow America, there was systemic racism, without a doubt. I mean, America was arguably systemically racist. Who could argue that Nazi Germany wasn't systemically anti-Semitic? In other words, or that Poland prior to World War II wasn't systemically anti-Semitic. So it is true that oppression can be woven into the very fabric of society. And I think we can accept that that can happen, but it's not always true. It's not always true. And this is a claim that it's defining American and Canadian and Western societies of today. And that's why I think, and offers very little opportunity for debate. And that second tenet, which the standpoint claim, the idea that only people with lived experience can define it for the rest of society, can also be true. In other words, there are insights in this. It can also be true. As a Jew who's experienced anti-Semitism in America, I grew up with a lot of people throwing, coins at my feet and drawing swastikas in my books in high school and the like. I know what that's like, and I'd like to think that I should have a say in how to define anti-Semitism for the rest of society. I have to say, right, a voice. But I don't have a monopoly on wisdom, because there are other Jews who have experienced things differently than I do, who might have different views about anti-Semitism. And there are other data points besides my own lived experience as well. Like the Pew survey showed that that American Jews are the most admired religious community in the United States. That means that that's another data point that might go against my own lived experience. So I have a voice because I've experienced anti-Semitism, but I don't get to tell everybody what to think because of that. And I think that that's why that in wokeism there are certain insights that are helpful as long as they don't shut down conversation. It's helpful to think about racism and oppression is systemic, and it's helpful to think about them in terms of lived experience, but neither of those things get to define the way we all think all the time. We got to be able to question them as well. And that's when it becomes a dogma and not just a theory. And you mentioned the word, critical race theory. Critical race theory draws the same ideological underpinnings as, it is wokeism. It is an expression of that. It could be, if it were used as such, just a theory. Like there is a version of critical race theory that I might disagree with, but I don't think is necessarily a toxic force. In other words, it says that yes, there are problems in our law, our civil rights law, and that there's systemic racism that our law hasn't really taken into account, and so forth. As a theoretical framework, that's fine. But as the great social psychologist Jonathan Haidt said, that critical race theory tends to be cuckoo. And by cuckoo, he doesn't mean crazy. He means like the cuckoo bird, which kicks the eggs out of other birds' nests, goes and takes them over. CRT, critical race theory, or wokeism, or whatever we're calling it, does that. It takes over other birds' nests and it kicks out all their eggs. It doesn't allow any conversation. And that's what makes it a rigid ideology and not just a theory.
Interesting. Well, okay, so let me move to sort of the second area, and that's around what are we going to do about it? And I know you've touched on it, but a number of the comments talk about they really feel a sense of fear and concern, especially facing their kids, say in the education system, for their young adults in their families seeking jobs and not being able to be hired on merit. And then there's that feeling that maybe our leading Jewish organizations have caved in and are not the voice that we need them to be. how do we face these challenges in a way that we aren't despairing, and who do we turn to help us with these challenges?
Yeah. So first of all, if we're going to get our own community on board, and I don't think we should give up on our mainstream institutions by and large. There may be a few that have sort of gone too far down the rabbit hole, but I think many haven't. And I think that's especially true in Canada, by the way. Not always true in the United States, but I think there's a lot of hope for a lot of the Canadian institutions. I think some of them, they're worried about alienating people. They're worried about alienating young people if they take an anti-woke stance. They're worried about alienating a couple donors. Look, you could have 30 donors, right? And only 2 of them might be woke, but you don't want to alienate those 2, so you stay quiet. And I think that's an abdication of leadership, and I think we've got to push them a little bit. And what I've noticed, look, I've been at this for a couple of years now, and as you can imagine, as someone who has been part of the mainstream left of the Jewish community, I'm not the most popular person in those places these days. And what I found is when let's say someone wants to invite me to speak at a synagogue or at a mainstream Jewish institution and the like, people behind the scenes are working so it doesn't happen. Give you an example of this. When my book came out in October, one of my first speaking gigs was very early in November at a Friday night Shabbat dinner function for this congregation. And it went up beautifully. Like I was expecting there to be hecklers and opposition, like not a single person out of the 80 had a critical word, really. I mean, there were people who pushed back, but in a very thoughtful way. And I left on cloud 9. A couple of days later, the rabbi calls and says, apparently, David, you have some detractors. I said, and he raised the possibility with the board of rabbis in the area that they would have me speak about this variant of anti-Semitism. And he got shouted down by the facilitator, who said, you will absolutely not talk about that I'm part of the problem, not part of the solution. So what I've learned from all that is that there are gatekeepers in the Jewish community who are trying to stop this conversation happening in mainstream Jewish organizations. But it doesn't mean that we have to give into that, because what I've found is that if you can find what I call a sponsor, somebody internal in these organizations who agrees that it's a problem, a lot of times they can challenge the institutions and get around the gatekeepers. And I think that's what we have to start doing. Like, and I found, and some of the first invitations that I've had have come from Canada. Like one of the first synagogues I spoke to was a Reformed temple in Vancouver, Canada. So I think that there are people out there that are willing to sort of maneuver around the obstacles that are placed by the gatekeepers, and we have to do a lot more of that. And I think if we do, over time, you might find that more and more these mainstream institutions start to actually call out this variant of anti-Semitism and start to name the ideological underpinnings. I mean, everybody agrees there's anti-Semitism on the left. You're not going to find many mainstream Jewish organizations or figures who won't readily admit to that. But what they don't do is they don't talk about the ideological underpinnings. They don't talk about the woke ideology that gives rise to it. And you think about that, that's really unique to left-wing anti-Semitism. Because when you talk about anti-Semitism on the right, we talk about the ideological underpinnings. We talk about, the Christian theological underpinnings. We talk about the Great Replacement theory. When we talk about anti-Semitism in the Muslim world, we talk about Islamist ideology. We talk about the perception of the infidel in parts of the Muslim world and in the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. But when we talk about anti-Semitism on the left, it's like we're talking about a symptom without causes. And I think we've got to get them to start naming the causes, because if you don't name the causes, you can't really fight it.
So one of the questions was, they take a note of pessimism from what you're saying, although I think your last answer might have answered it, but is it too late? Has wokeism so ingrained in our community that we're just too far down the rabbit hole to fight back? Especially, and I think this is a related question, but you may not see it that way, especially because a lot of the anti-Semitism education in the schools has to do with the Holocaust. And is that really the way to challenge this wokeism?
So The Holocaust education by itself is not going to challenge that. I'm not sure Holocaust education. Look, I believe we should all learn about the Holocaust, and I'm glad Holocaust education has become something that many school systems are teaching. But I don't know that it does much, and I don't think there's very much evidence that it's actually a bulwark against anti-Semitism. I'm sorry to say, there's very little evidence that school systems and places that embrace Holocaust education are less anti-Semitic. Again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't teach it, because the Holocaust is an important historical event and central to who we are as Jews, but that doesn't mean it's really doing anything to mitigate anti-Semitism. I'm not overly pessimistic in the long run. I think this is a generational fight. I think these concepts, woke concepts, are not popular. I mean, we have polling on that. I mean, they're just not popular. The problem is that people will will pretend to support it in some instances, or just stay quiet because they don't want to upset anybody. They're risk averse. So we're seeing in the United States, I don't know what the data says in Canada, but I'll bet you it's similar. We're seeing some of the highest rates of self-censorship in American history. People are self-censoring at rates higher than they were in the McCarthy era. But that doesn't mean that if we over time that we can't change that dynamic. And I think we are changing it. It's easier now to speak out than it was. A year, just to give you a sense, a year ago, I could not have gotten speaking gigs in mainstream Jewish institutions. But now that's not the case. Now that's changing rapidly. The floodgates are starting to open. And that's, I think, because we're people like me, I'll pat myself on the back a little bit, are doing some good work. I'm not the only one. There are others that are doing some good work and pushing our way in. We no longer have to kick the door down. We can ring the doorbell more, but also because the larger ideological environment is beginning to thaw. The problem is, while that happens, the institutions that are the most committed to this ideology are doubling down. They're almost sensing that the winds, the ideological winds, are changing. And so they're trying to lock this in as much as they can, particularly in school systems. That's why I think we have to be very vigilant now and fight back, because I do think we can change the ideological environment and the political environment over time, because more and more people are not going to like it and they're going to speak out. But these institutions are going to make commitments that are very hard to reverse.
So we now talk about the new anti-Semitism as being sort of, Israel being the canary in the minefield. Would you coin wokeism as the new anti-Semitism? And by pushing back, are we at risk of alienating an ally or allies in the Black community?
Yeah, those are good questions. It's very funny that you asked that question. I didn't expect that, because my organization has been contemplating a name change because we're emphasizing really this new variant of anti-Semitism. The term new anti-Semitism was actually quite popular in the early 2000s after the Durban Conference on Racism and Xenophobia, which was this really watershed for the Jewish community. It was after the Camp David peace deal had sort of fell apart, and the second intifada was unleashed. All of a sudden we started feeling this kind of pressure on college campuses and the protests and the anti-Zionism. And so that was sort of dubbed the new anti-Semitism at the time, but it was renamed delegitimization of Israel in around 2009 by a report done by an Israeli think tank called the Reut Institute. So we haven't really used that word new anti-Semitism, but we've been flirting with the possibility of calling our organization, so we're using the term new anti-Semitism in the name of the organization. And I do think it is appropriate to think of it as the new anti-Semitism. Do we risk alienating people in the Black community? Of course you risk alienating some people in the Black community, but I'll point out that the Black community is quite diverse. According to the Pew survey, 62% of Black Americans oppose affirmative action in higher education. Now, I'm not saying whether you should or shouldn't support affirmative action in higher education. What I am saying is it speaks volumes about the amount of political and ideological diversity in the Black community. So what we usually think of as the Black community, really a group of carefully curated figures and organizations that claim to be speaking for the larger community. But when you dig a little deeper, you realize that there's tremendous heterodoxy in the Black community, and it's up to us to get to know those voices and those leaders and to build new allies, because they're out there for the taking.
Let's hope. I mean, we've certainly seen the conflict in places like New York. So let's hope that
Yeah.
we can get on top
And
of
that's
that.
an interesting one, by the way, because I want to point out, in New York, for example, where you've seen attacks against Orthodox Jews go way up in recent years, and these are racialized Black men committing these violent acts against Orthodox Jews, and by the way, Asians as well have been also victims of this violence. But I would point out, that we shouldn't overgeneralize in that way, because it's actually it's not happening everywhere in New York. It's really 3 boroughs in New York, and it's not happening everywhere where there are Blacks and Jews living together.
Mhm.
And I say that because I don't want us to say, oh, this is that. I mean, that is a problem, and that we need to speak out and be very aggressive. But I don't want to say that the county next to me, which is 60-some% African American, and has a very robust Jewish community as well, there has not been a single issue or instance of Black on Jew violence. So I don't want us to think that that's a universal threat faced by the Jewish community. It is a threat, a very, very acute threat faced in parts of New York, and I think we should understand it as so.
So I know time is running, so maybe I'll turn to sort of the third area that I see people asking questions, and that's Canada is a community with very strong love for Israel, for a Zionistic. All surveys tell us our Zionism remains strong. Certainly, I think some challenges, but we hear, our mainstream media talking in a way that is disparaging of the Jewish state, apartheid, occupations, reliance on old tropes, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe the question is, and how does this work into wokeism? Zionism today, is it becoming a victim of this wokeism, anti-Semitism of which you write and speak? And again, who do we look to for help for this? Is it our rabbis? Is it our politicians? Is it some of the organizations, and perhaps you can even name a few that you yourself work with?
Yeah, look, yes, it absolutely is playing into perceptions of Israel. I think that's, without question. Even people who are critical of me in the thesis in my book, and would many of them would sort of agree that that's a phenomena. That's absolutely the case. When you have a philosophy that divides people into oppressed and oppressors, and that equates success with oppression, Jews are going to be viewed as the oppressors, and Israel, the most successful country in the Middle East by far, is going to be viewed as the oppressor. So that's why I would argue you saw in May 2021, Israel really being blamed in a way that it hadn't before, at least in the US, for the conflict. You could follow this trajectory. I've been in the pro-Israel community my entire career. So I remember going back to 2008 in the first rounds of hostility between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. It would basically follow a pattern. In the first few days, the mainstream American media would sort of give Israel the benefit of the doubt. It was facing rocket fire and so forth. But within 3 or 4 days into it, as the casualties started to mount, Israel would start to fall under pressure. And 5, 6 days into it, there would be these calls to end all hostilities because of the disproportionate violence. Israel didn't even get that early benefit of the doubt in May 2021. So you can see how that an ideology that views Israel's success and its greater firepower over Hamas as inherently an act of oppression. I mean, the fact that, you could say, well, Israel's got a great army, Israel tries hard not to claim civilian casualties and the like. It doesn't matter in this ideology. And what matters is that you're the stronger party, so you must be the oppressor. And that's why, of course, this ideology is going to lead to more and more anti-Zionism. And it's going to be internalized by some Jewish young people who are then going to become anti-Zionist and have become anti-Zionist. And that's really tragic. So that's why I argue that really there's no fighting anti-Semitism without fighting its ideological underpinnings. Like, we are part of a larger ideological fight, whether we want to be or not. So if a Jewish organization says, well, I don't want to fight against woke ideology, but I want to fight against the anti-Semitism that comes out of woke ideology, I mean, good luck with that. I just don't understand what that even means, because the ideology is going to constantly produce anti-Semitism.
Right. Well, and times are running, and I know lots of people need to clean up. My saying is, may Jew hatred pass over you in 2023. But let me just ask one more question. Can you be then a question related to the name of your organizations? Can you be liberal and against wokeism in this age, and how do you do it?
Yeah. Well, the way that we use the word liberal is the opposite of wokeism. It means the open expression of ideas, the free expression of ideas. That's what I mean by liberal in its classical usage. I think in America and Canada, the word liberal has become conflated with political progressivism, but that's not what it originally meant, and that's not what we mean. So when we say somebody or an ideology is illiberal, it means it's stifling of alternative points of view. So the answer is yes, of course. Look, like you could support universal health care, which we don't have in the United States, or you could support gun control, which we don't have a lot of in the United States, or you could support reproductive rights or same-sex marriage, so on and so forth, and still believe in the free expression of ideas and believe that some of these woke precepts are crazy. And I think there are a lot of liberal people. There are people who are way to the left of me who are extremely critical of woke ideology. So I don't think we should view this as an indictment of all progressive thought. There are progressive thinkers who are among the most powerful voices against the onslaught of this ideology. And we should be making friends, not enemies. I'm looking for people who stick up for liberal democratic values. That's what I'm looking for. Be they from the right, be they from the left. Those are our new friends. And there's no reason at all to believe that just because somebody, supports politically liberal position like reproductive rights, that they have to be, hyper woke and therefore operating inimically to the Jewish people. I don't think that's the case, nor do I think it would be healthy for us to think of it as the case.
So I'm going to thank you, and maybe you can give us a heads up. What's your next book, or is there something that you're reading that you love before I turn it over to our executive director at CAEF, Andrea?
Yeah, I'm very interested in the idea of patriotic pluralism, both in a place like America and Canada, and the idea that we can both be pluralistic and patriotic. I think sometimes the political right is patriotic, but not as pluralistic as it should be, and the political left is pluralistic, but not as patriotic as it should be. And I think we have to find our sea legs. So I'm interested in defining patriotic pluralism and may well write a book about it at some point.
Okay, something to look forward to. Over to you, Andrea, and may I thank you very much, David, for this very insightful talk.
Chag Sameach, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, David. And you ended with 2 P's, so I'll just add something. First of all, I'm now excited to read about patriotic pluralism. I think that the Jews are too passive and positive, and that we need to be, as you said, more challenging. I think we let a lot of things slide off our back and we don't want to take it seriously. It can't really be that bad. People turn away from some of the negative stories. And I have lots of friends who don't want to hear about anti-Semitism. They think it's absurd in our society to be even focused on it. So I think that what you've offered us is a very challenging thought. I think Rabbi Corey putting it in the context of Passover is very apropos. Now is a good time to be talking about it. I would like to, before I make a few comments just on summing it up, to say that we need to thank the sponsors, organizations we've been working with. I think it's really important to point out that our effort, both JTeach, which is the organization Corey's with, and the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, are very, very interested in collaboration. And I noticed a lot of the comments from people about who do we work with and how do we influence the Jewish leadership. I would suggest that it's important that we get more organizations collaborating. So I want to thank Beth Tikva Synagogue, which had offered to not only sponsor, but host our event this evening. And unfortunately, we weren't able to go there. The Lodger Center Synagogue, Stand With Us Canada, Students Supporting Israel, which is an American organization newly established in Canada, and their student body at one of the Toronto universities experienced just this past week a terrible example of anti-Semitism on campus. Doctors Against Racism and Anti-Semitism, and Jew Hatred Canada, B'nai B'rith Canada, And an organization, you talked about allies, that's very important for us to bring to everyone's attention is the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, FAIR, which is also an American organization recently operating in Canada, which is made up of people who are primarily concerned about the introduction of critical race theory, wokeism, identity politics, and all of that in our educational system. And they're here to find candidates who believe in what they call human education, pro-human programs, as opposed to ideological programs, and promote them in various school boards. So I think that also suggests to me a way that we can challenge this, which is to become, in some ways, politically active. FAIR speaks to the world of politics, saying, get out there and become a candidate if you want to change things. And maybe it's time that some of us as activist Jewish leaders need to also do that, as opposed to just writing letters and telling Yenim and telling the other guy what they should be doing. Maybe we need to be seen more in the forefront of that. I wanted to just make a comment that struck me as you were speaking, David, as you described the growth of this or the spread of wokeism. And that takes me back to a concept some of us remember from several decades ago, the tipping point, right? And I think we have to be very concerned. The literature on the tipping point, Malcolm Gladwell, is that when an idea hits 10% of the population, it's almost too late to reverse it. And it can tip us over into something much, much worse than what we're experiencing now. We are seeing discrimination. We are hearing about anti-Semitism. We are seeing kids protest against Israel and scream Free Palestine. We are not seeing the level of attacks that you've had in the US, nor would we wish to, and nor has all of America. My fear is that if we don't act now, we will hit that tipping point. So I'm suggesting that you come back and tell us how we can do more to push back. And I think that's the name of this. We have to fight back. We cannot ignore it. We cannot allow that narratives or lived experience deny facts and evidence. And I think we're living in a time when the narratives become the end all and the be all. And I think that's also dangerous. So I want to thank you for so many concepts and ideas and thoughtfulness that you've given to everyone here tonight. And thank everybody for joining us and participating. And to end with a commercial. We are, as a collective in Toronto, organizing the Stronger Together Fighting to End Jew Hatred Conference for September. We would like everyone to think of how they can contribute and participate. If you'd like to donate to it, please go to the website for CAF, just www.caf.ca. You can indicate a donation for the conference. We are acting as the financial administrators, and I hope that many of you will attend. And now back to Corey.
David, I want to personally thank you on behalf of everybody here and on behalf of all the attendees. I know that we all appreciate very much what you have to say. Personally, I've read through your book twice, and I have to say that on the second reading, I learned even more than on the first one. So I recommend to everybody, I'm going to reach over my shoulder here. This is the book by David Bernstein, Woke Antisemitism. And the easiest way to get it is to go to Amazon, amazon.ca. You can get it in Canadian pricing. I do absolutely recommend it to anybody who is interested in analyzing or exploring this topic. I just want to mention, Andrea, you mentioned that we are putting together this major conference, and it is something that is extremely important. And I want to mention that we actually have 35 different community organizations that are involved in putting this together. So when people say, we're not doing stuff as a community and too little too late, well, I have to say it's never too late. We absolutely need this. We need it right now. And we need to bring together the entire community to be on one page and to have one voice. And that doesn't matter if you're egalitarian, reconstructionist, reform, conservative, orthodox. It doesn't matter if you're unaffiliated or affiliated with, any specific organization. I mean, anti-Semitism, as we know, is something when it starts with the Jews, does not end with the Jews. And we know that hatred and horrible acts starts with words. So we absolutely need to be involved in this, and we need as many voices and representation from the community as possible. So please go to the website, strongertogether.co.il. please join. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to email me directly at rabbicorey@jteach.ca or rabbicorey@strongertogether.co.il. I would be happy to answer questions about specifics. And we are very much hoping to see David there as well in September on the 10th. And we look forward to seeing all of you. Thank you once again, David. Thank you, everyone else. Have a wonderful evening.
And Chag Sameach.
And Chag Sameach.